Welcome to this lecture. I'm Nick Pearce. I'm the director of the Institute for Policy Research, an institution in the university that works on public policy challenges. And I'm very pleased that this evening we have Dame Fiona Reynolds here to talk to us about beauty, in particular this book that she's written, The Fight for Beauty. And you might ask yourself, what is a public policy institute doing concerning itself with the question of beauty? Aren't we supposed to worry about things like social justice or liberty or economic growth, things of this kind? Well, it is an interesting and important question. How do you think about beauty in public policy? We all know that public authorities, and you could hardly not know this in a city like Bath, have to be concerned with the conservation of things, the protection and maintenance of things, even the creation of things that are deemed to be beautiful. But what does beauty mean in public policy? Do we agree on it? Do we have to agree on it? If we don't agree on it, what do we do? And how do we think about beauty alongside other objectives of public policy, like the question of social justice, or the question of freedom, or the question of social policy objectives that we care about, housing, welfare, and so on? So it's a big and important and interesting challenge. It's not one that politicians often tread upon, I think. The former Cabinet Office Minister, Oliver Letwin, better known for his intelligence and his political nous, I think, probably fair to say, once gave a lecture arguing for beauty in public policy. He's the only politician I can think of that's done that in my lifetime, certainly. So, although we have lots of arguments and debates about beauty in public policy, it's not something we often address through the lens of, or as an issue, or for public policy activity, research, and so on. So we're delighted that you're here with us this evening, Dame Fiona. Dame Fiona Reynolds, as you will know, is Master of Emmanuel College in Cambridge. For many years before that, the Director General of the National Trust. During a period when it underwent a lot of growth, it opened up to the public, it did things differently, which I think many people would agree that Dame Fiona was responsible for. And before that, worked in the Cabinet Office as well. So a huge amount of experience of these sort of worlds of policy and also out there in the world itself, in the beautiful world itself. So over to you, Dame Fiona.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming on this beautiful evening. And indeed, that is the subject of my talk, why beauty does play a central role. Because one of the extraordinary things is that while beauty is a word that we all use freely, confidently to describe places we love, experiences or views or places we've visited, it's a word we feel very comfortable with using. It is not a word that politicians use today and that you will find in public policy statements. Indeed, it's about 50 years since the word beauty was used to define legislation or public policy objectives. And whether we're talking about the beauty of landscape, the beauty of nature, or indeed the beauty of our cultural heritage, this, something which is so instinctive and so familiar and so delightful to us all and stirs our souls and brings us often to a point of transformation, politicians today seem almost embarrassed to talk about these experiences. Maybe it's because the word beauty does conjure up emotions and not something that can be measured or something that can be objectively defined. Or maybe it's actually because they feel awkward themselves in using the word. But as a result, when we talk about beautiful places, we've substituted a sort of management speak to describe something that we would probably say was beautiful, but now becomes something like ecosystem services, or natural capital, or biodiversity, words that simply don't touch our soul or our heart in any shape or form. And yet it wasn't always like this. Beauty was a word that once that in society we used freely, confidently. It was part of our national narrative. And indeed, when you think right back to the earliest days, Chaucer wrote that it was the beauty of an April spring that longed folk to go on pilgrimages. Actually, I feel like going on a pilgrimage myself in this beautiful, nearly April spring. The extraordinary churches that were built in the Saxon era onwards, where these could have been utilitarian buildings, but they weren't. They were glorifying beauty for the worship of God. And throughout our history, poets, writers, musicians, artists have all talked about beauty, have all celebrated beauty freely. Perhaps especially the Romantic poets, and perhaps especially William Wordsworth. But even they didn't use beauty just to describe aesthetics. There was a very real sense of kind of moral, spiritual dimension to the way they wrote. So Wordsworth, for example, in lines written above Tintern Abbey, wrote, "To recognise in nature and the language of the sense the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul." This was beauty as a way of opening up a kind of real sense of moral responsibility, of kind of ethics, as well as the aesthetic perfection of what he was looking at. Now, of course, he wrote frequently about the lakes, and this is a contemporary view by John Glover of Thirlmere in the 1820s, before it was turned into a reservoir. This was what Wordsworth, tramping the hills, was so delighted by, so entranced by. But it was also the place in which you could probably argue that the movement for beauty began, because it was Wordsworth in his 1810 Guide to the Lake District that wrote about the suburban villas that were invading these beautiful valleys, wrote about the extraction of ore, which was ramping up to industrial levels. And perhaps most of all, he wrote about the railway, that wretched railway, which was arriving, the railway to Windermere, and of course about which he wrote in 1843 those words that no conservationist will ever forget: "Is then no nook of English ground secure from rash assault." He also wrote about the spiky larch, this extraordinary native woodland, beginning to be overtaken by the spiky larch, which in his view transformed in an ugly way these beautiful landscapes. And perhaps that was the moment that the admiration of beauty tipped over into a recognition of the need for its defence. But if there was a big debate about the rash assault taking place in the Lake District, perhaps the real rash assault was the process of urbanisation which was taking over our cities. This is a very famous cartoon by Cruikshank of 1829, London going out of town, or the march of bricks and mortar, and indeed they are marching. Look at the bricks being thrown out of the kiln and landing on the poor hayricks which are fleeing for their lives. These automatons of urbanism marching out to colonise the countryside, and these tenements decaying even as they are built, because they were being built so fast and with such poor heed to any kind of standards that they were kind of terrible places to live. And this was happening at such a fast pace. In Sheffield alone, between 1831 and 1836, 156 new streets were built. And as I say, these were not beautiful streets. The conditions in which people were living, lack of water, lack of sanitation, lack of access to any kind of fresh air or fresh food, really created a national scandal, a scandal of the kind that there were parliamentary inquiries and great exercises of investigation to explore the terrible conditions in which people were living, real concerns about health and well-being, and cholera and typhoid and the spread of infectious diseases. But out of all that cacophony of debate came perhaps the most important voice ever for beauty, John Ruskin. John Ruskin, a child born into that ferment, who had, as a child, not only had the Bible read to him several times over, so he grew up with a very strong sense of religious and moral conscience, but also as a child had a cyanometer to measure the blue of the sky, because he feared that growing up the sky would no longer be blue. He was a man who travelled widely. He had an epiphanal moment in the Alps where he watched a storm break over Chamonix and said, again with a profound sense of kind of moral and spiritual connection, that this is what beauty is, this extraordinary interaction between nature and the human experience. He spoke in public meetings up and down the country, cramming town halls full of people to hear his words about beauty, art and architecture. And he inspired many people. He inspired William Morris and the movement for arts and crafts, revival of the Gothic architecture, and of course he also set up the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, was set up in his memory. He also inspired this young woman, who has been a personal heroine of mine as long as I can remember, Octavia Hill, who first met Ruskin when she was teaching in a ragged school in London. And she, as a very young woman, she was only a teenager herself, used to take the ragged school children out of London, 10 miles on a Saturday, out into the countryside so that they could feel green grass under their feet and smell fresh air and pick flowers and experience beauty, because they had none in their lives. She went on, as many of you will know, to become the pioneer of social housing. But alongside decent housing with a roof over people's head and enough food to eat, she was also determined to give people access to beauty. So she would try and ensure there was somewhere for the children to play, or if there was no space for a playground, she would insist on there being a window box of flowers, something to bring beauty into people's lives. And as time went on, she became increasingly involved in the movement to protect the green spaces of London, which were rapidly being built on. She called them open-air sitting rooms for the poor, and she worked with others to protect places like Parliament Hill Fields or Hilly Fields or Vauxhall Park, places we take for granted today, but which certainly would have been built on had it not been for her efforts. And of course, with her colleagues on the left, Canon Hardwicke Rawnsley, who'd taken over Wordsworth's mantle as the defender of the Lake District, and on the right, Robert Hunter, who was the lawyer for the Commons Preservation Society, the oldest amenity society. These trio, here's Octavia a little bit older, it has to be said, but they set up an organisation devoted to beauty, the National Trust, perhaps the organisation best known throughout the world, and a really extraordinary organisation, as all of you here will know. But I think what's really extraordinary is that their legacy was not just about looking back. It was not just about preserving beautiful places and protecting things that were vulnerable. Their legacy was also about looking forward, and they themselves were hugely forward thinkers. And the words of the very first planning bill to be introduced into Parliament could have been written by this trio. It says the purpose of the bill is to establish the home healthy, the house beautiful, the town pleasant, the city dignified, and the suburbs salubrious. And again, it's a reminder of how central beauty and the quality of life was seen in the urban transformation which was going on, still in response to those enormous pressures that I talked about earlier. And the government, as indicated by its own promotion of a planning bill, was absolutely convinced about the need for this rounded approach, this approach for housing and other improvements that respected people's wider needs. But of course, their efforts were interrupted by the First World War, that war that arrived, as it were, so quickly without notice. And while the government became preoccupied by the war, people did not forget beauty. And there are poignant stories of young men going to their death in the trenches with copies of A. Housman's A Shropshire Lad in their jacket pocket. The First World War poets who wrote so movingly about their terrible wartime experiences also wrote movingly about the England that they were fighting for. The motivation for going to war was to fight for that spirit of England. And I'm sure, we all of us could quote examples. Edward Thomas, for example, who agonized for years about whether to sign up, finally signing up and being asked why he stooped, he picked up a clod of earth and said, "It's for this that I am signing up." And of course, he died very soon into his term of service. But the government promised the returning heroes, and they were heroes, a land fit for heroes, homes fit for heroes. There was going to be a real response to the needs of the people along the lines of the pre-war legislation and the plans, the interrupted plans. But of course, again, as history tells us, these ambitious plans were not fulfilled. The country was broke, there was a huge influenza epidemic, the government again distracted, did not deliver, could not find the means to build the homes and to provide the better lives that had been promised. And of course, into a vacuum, there is always somebody willing to step. And into that vacuum stepped the speculative developers, the people who simply wanted to make a quick buck about building lots of houses. There's no doubt that that was needed, but had no interest at all in the design or where the houses went or any kind of sense of contributing to a community or a wider benefit. And there was outrage about this kind of sprawl that suddenly began in the 1920s and 30s to spread out from every major city. There was no planning control, there was no ability to decide where housing went or how it was built. And it's remarkable how broad that concern was. The government shared it as much as many of the commentators. And indeed, out of this concern came a new breed of campaigners for beauty. People like Patrick Abercrombie, one of the early town planners, who was instrumental in setting up the CPRE. Clough Williams-Ellis, the architect whose book England and the Octopus described so vividly this octopus sprawling out, gobbling up beautiful rural England with not a backward glance. G.M. Trevelyan, the Regius Professor of History at Cambridge University, wrote a pamphlet, "Must England's Beauty Perish?" he wrote, rhetorical of course, advocating the National Trust as the great hope for protecting beauty. J.B. Priestley wrote rather poignantly that the 1920s, 1930s damage to the beauty of England was far greater than the Industrial Revolution, which had been confined just to a few places, because this was threatening to take over the whole country, and indeed it was. And again, the government started to respond. There was a planning bill in 1935 which began the first steps towards more strategic planning, but very faltering. And once again, those efforts interrupted by war. And once again, it was the beauty of England that was used as a kind of cri de coeur, an inspirational call to arms. Your Britain, fight for it now. That sense of what people were fighting for, absolutely at the heart of the government's recruitment effort. But this time, those in power were absolutely clear. Never again would people return to a shattered England. Never again would promises be broken. This time, a commitment to protecting the beauty of England, to providing for people's needs, would be met. And the wartime leader, coalition leader, Churchill, was absolutely determined to create a better future after the Second World War. And indeed, as the war began, he set up the Post-War Reconstruction Committee, chaired for a while by John Reith, who left the BBC and went into government for the wartime effort. A cross-party group who commissioned work from people like Beveridge on social policy, from Barlow on the future of industrial policy, from Scott and Uthwat on rural areas and how planning mechanisms should work, putting together a post-war reconstruction plan that would be based on how to meet both people's material needs for jobs and housing and employment and all of the infrastructure that was needed, but also their non-material needs, a very conscious focus on the way to recognise the things in public life that needed to be provided. But of course, as we all know, Churchill didn't win the election, Attlee did. And I always put this slide up, not just to make that point, but to just count the women in the cabinet. There is one right over there, but thank goodness things are different today. But it was Attlee, but Attlee picked up that cross-party consensus. The agenda that he implemented was very much based on the work. He'd been a member of the Post-War Reconstruction Committee. He had been part of that consensus. And he was determined to implement those plans for which preparation had been made. So as I say, as well as education, health, which we all know about, housing, jobs and welfare systems, the post-war government implemented for national parks, for the protection of huge areas, this is the Peak District, of beautiful countryside, for access. And this is a remarkable picture. This is Tom Stevenson of the Ramblers Association leading 6 members of Parliament, of whom 3 were in the Cabinet, on a 3-day walk in the North Pennines. Now, I would like to get 6 members of the present government, especially the Cabinet, on a 3-day walk in the North Pennines. A reminder just of their commitment. And Lewis Silkin, who introduced the bill, said, the enjoyment of our leisure in the open air and the ability to leave our towns and walk on the moors and in the dales without fear of interruption are just as much a part of positive health and well-being as are the building of hospitals or insurance against sickness. So we think we're very clever today, making the connection between well-being and public access. They had it there. They understood it. Their whole vision was around creating these non-material benefits for people as well as material benefits. They also legislated for nature protection, for the first nature reserves and sites of special scientific interest. And finally, of course, they finally introduced proper, comprehensive town and country planning to protect the countryside, but also to put boundaries around the terrible sprawl. And in fact, this is also the period at which the first green belts were designated. This is Sheffield, which has a very important green belt as part of its mechanism to contain urban sprawl, and also very committed to the building of housing and meeting people's needs, but to do so in a way that almost is reminiscent of Octavia Hill. This is Stevenage in the very early 1950s, and you can see the conscious attempt to provide green space, to provide trees, to provide a sense of beauty and connection with nature as an integral part of the new towns. And it's really interesting that in the midst of all this, there was a white paper on land, 1944 white paper on land. There's never been one since. And I think it's a quite remarkable document because it spells out in terms that are crystal clear what are the bad uses of land. And the bad uses of land are basically wasteful uses of land, sprawl and unplanned development, which waste land and make it expensive to provide services and cause danger by roads that are too fast that children will get killed running over. A real kind of anger about the bad uses of land. And by contrast, the good uses of land, which aim to provide in a harmonious way to meet all the needs of society, and those needs again spelled out as both material and non-material needs. Now that kind of sophisticated view of an integrated approach seeking harmony through land use, I think was really profoundly important part of this package. But beauty, absolutely central to that, recognising people's need for beauty. Beauty was in that legislation the last time it was there, and part of that legacy that was to be bestowed on future generations. Now, it has to be said, I have to say that ever since then, it's been downhill all the way. Somehow we've lost that sense of passion for beauty, of recognition for beauty, of recognition for the importance of harmony and integration. And so the post-war period, and latterly my own involvement since the early 1980s as a campaigner, have been about the fight for beauty having to be kind of revived and repeated time and time again. And in a way, it's been a kind of series of debates, which my book describes in different chapters, about how, in some cases, unexpected things happened, but where beauty got lost from the agenda. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of some of the ways in which the fight for beauty has had to be revived. The first is farming, because back in the 1940s, farming was seen as a totally itself harmonious pursuit, that actually the practice of farming itself produced beauty, and there was no anticipation of what was to come. And what was to come, of course, sponsored by the 1947 Agriculture Act, was intense investment in increasing production for the very legitimate and important purpose of growing more food. But what got lost on the way was a kind of sense of harmony through agriculture. So we lost huge numbers of countryside features, the intensive production causing damage to both nature and wildlife and also to landscape. One of my first fights was actually on Exmoor, where Tom King is here, and it's wonderful to see him remember this very, very well, where the investment in improvement of agriculture, even in the national park, which had been recently designated late in the 1950s, resulted in a quarter of the moorland being lost in that period through agricultural improvement. And there was a huge, huge debate in Parliament and elsewhere about it. But I have to say, a debate that did result in new agricultural policies designed to try to restore that sense of harmony. But goodness, it was a very bitter fight of its time. Hay meadows the same. 90% of hay meadows were lost in England in the years between the mid-40s and the mid-80s through, again, agricultural intensification, ploughing out, intensification of pasture land, and a loss of about a fifth of our hedgerows in the period of the 1970s alone. And yet, as we know, farming can and does produce many, many beautiful landscapes. And one of the things I think that we need to try to get from this new debate now about how we're going to manage agricultural policy as we leave the European Union is whether we can rediscover that ambition for harmony, that sense of engagement. How can farming produce beautiful landscapes, can produce food, can provide work, can provide a kind of integrated, harmonious set of outcomes? And we must get it right. I chart in my book the pressures have been caused by soil degradation and intensification, causing really serious environmental harm. We now must get that right. There have been fights, perhaps counterintuitively, about trees too, going back to the Lake District and Wordsworth's spiky larch. There was an absolute battle royal in the Lake District in the 1920s when the new Forestry Commission wanted to plant lots of trees. They were trying to plant trees to replenish the Navy's stock. Even in those days, the Navy, of course, didn't need wooden ships for very long, it has to be said. But this was a kind of assault on the Lake District that caused huge rows. And in fact, it was CPRE that negotiated with the Forestry Commission in the mid-1930s that there should be a ban on planting in the Central Lakes. But that was not true of many other upland areas which had this sort of wall-to-wall Sitka spruce, causing, again, huge concern about its impact both on nature and landscape and indeed access. And when I arrived in the 1980s, this kind of wall-to-wall Sitka spruce with no sense of softening the edges or diversifying the woodland was still going on. My very first fight at CNP was actually about a plantation in the Brecon Beacons, which we failed. It went ahead, and it still sits like a sore thumb in the landscape. And yet, you know, our native woodlands are extraordinarily important. Trees in the right place bring great joy, great beauty, great wildlife and landscape benefit. But again, there were still pressures, again through forestry intensification, to underplant our traditional woodlands, and big rows over the years about loss of ancient woodland. In fact, even to this day, HS2 and the loss of ancient woodland is causing a big argument. And it still continues. I mean, if you think about one of my last fights at the National Trust was when the government extraordinarily announced it was going to sell off the entire public forest estate. I don't know if you remember that moment. Quite bizarre in many ways. One might have understood if they just decided to sell the conifer plantations, the commercial plantations, but no, it was places like the New Forest and the Forest of Dean with immense cultural and historic interest. But actually, that was a rather quick reversal. I remember the moment when Ed Miliband, do you remember him, stood up in the House of Commons and asked the Prime Minister, remember him, David Cameron, and said, does the Prime Minister support the policy of his right honourable friend to sell off the public forest estate? David Cameron said, no, and sat down. End of that particular campaign. That was one of the most extraordinary changes I think I ever witnessed. But yes, battles, surprisingly, about trees, but actually also about the coast. And back in the 1920s and 30s, before there was any kind of planning control, there were huge concerns about this kind of development on the coast, caravans or bungalows or uncontrolled development. And again, it was CPRE and the early campaigners who drew attention to the beauty of the coast and began to get coastal planning policies in place. But perhaps above all, the National Trust with its Neptune campaign, an extraordinarily prescient campaign from the 1960s onwards, proactively buying up beautiful coastline and protecting it, to the point that today, if you fly over the Mediterranean or other coastlines, and indeed many parts of the world, you can see how damaged the coast is. And we, in this country, have actually pulled off an extraordinary success, not least due to those early and wise actions by voluntary bodies. There were fights about roads too, my goodness, the fights about roads, not just because roads themselves, when they're built, create environmental damage, but because at one point, back in the 1980s, we were endlessly arguing because the government had a policy of predict and provide, so that if a road was predicted to be full of traffic, then the obvious solution was to build a bigger road, and then that became full of traffic, and it just built up in a sort of cyclical way. And there seemed no way of challenging whether perhaps there was another solution or another way of looking at things. In fact, the rows, some of you will remember Swampy, do you remember Swampy at the Newbury bypass? And this one one of the most contentious was this is the M3 through St Catherine's Hill near Winchester, now actually just in the South Downs National Park. But this was a very painful moment, this historic and very spiritual landscape sliced through. This is almost the last of that particular breed of road. And again, the government did stop and did say, well, perhaps we should do traffic management, perhaps we could have different ways of meeting traffic demands and our demands to move around. And of course, the planning system itself has been the subject of many rows over many decades, some of which in more recent years I've been involved. And some of it was because planning, though a brilliant idea, and that post-war vision of planning positively to meet our needs, to decide where new development should go as well as where it should not, didn't always deliver early on as it should. And there were some awful examples of complete reconstruction, often of historic town centres, which back in the 1950s did give planning, a sticky start in certain areas. And of course, in a sense, planning since then has always been very much in the public eye, often accused of stifling development. Successive governments have proposed either to relax the green belts or to relax planning controls, or in many ways, find solutions which weakened planning. And indeed, right through to my own, again, last experience at the National Trust, where the government published a new draft national planning policy guidance framework, which had in it the words which to most of us were just extraordinarily provocative, that the default answer to a planning application should be yes. Now that seemed to strike at the heart of all of us who'd fought for balance and harmony, that planning shouldn't be about stopping things, but about guiding things to the right place, and should be about the ability, though, also to say no to things that were proposed in the wrong places. And so unusually, the National Trust had a very proactive campaign, petitions at our properties, a really strong campaign with immense public support, resulting in many thousands, tens of thousands of signatures being delivered to Parliament. And in a way, it was a sort of moment of kind of revival of some of that Octavia Hill spirit of the National Trust standing up for a purpose that was so clearly in line with our objectives and so important to the public. In fact, I think our trustees had worried that there would be criticism of the Trust for campaigning, but certainly I was stopped endlessly on the train, on the bus, and saying, please, please carry on. We need to see the National Trust doing this extraordinary campaigning work. And again, the government did pull back, certainly by deleting those words from its planning guidance. I wouldn't say a complete reversal, but certainly pulled back from the worst excesses. But yet again, we have to remember, we can get this right. We can build beautifully. We can find the right places for good development to go. This is a rural development in Gloucestershire, near where I live. And this is in Cambridge, where I also live now for half the year, and more than half the year. And this is a sort of dense urban development, hugely popular with residents, wins on sustainability, wins on beauty, actually creates a lovely environment to live in. And perhaps above all, we need a good, strong planning system to get our cities right, because cities are where most of us are going to live and where most of us want to live and work and to live happy lives. The contrast with the sort of awful cities of the early and late 19th century. Now, this is Newcastle, which has had a big urban regeneration programme, but there are the beginnings of some really, really vital, in a sense, remodelling of urban areas to provide more sustainable lifestyles, but good homes within walking distance or cycling distance of working spaces, a kind of sense of a livable, breathable, green city, a really exciting opportunity, but one we must grasp if we're going to find solutions. Beauty, again, makes places livable and happy places to live. So to hear me talk, you would think that this is all about government policy and getting it right and arguing and all the rest of it. And I suppose there is a bit of that, and certainly my book does chart the many, many ways in which getting public policy right is very, very important. But I suppose that my real message of my book, that this is actually, it's all about us. It's about us and what we value. And one of the reasons why the post-war period has been so contentious is because it's been about this kind of fight between economism on the one hand and sort of values on the other. And I use that word economism, which is a horrible word. It means that where the economy is the sort of driving and most powerful force. I use it advisedly, partly because it is a kind of unusual word. But I also use it because I found a quote from an American economist from the 1940s, which seemed to sort of capture this dilemma. This is Albert J. Nock, writing in 1943. He said, "Economism can build a society which is rich, prosperous, powerful, even one which has a reasonably wide diffusion of material well-being. It cannot build one which is lovely, one which has savour and depth, and which exercises the irresistible power of attraction that loveliness wields." And that seems to me to capture the absolute essence, because this is really a question of whether we are just striving always for growth, always for sort of short-term material benefits, or whether we can sort of heed the words of that post-war coalition which talked about harmony and integration and kind of meeting our needs in a much more rounded way. But there is enormous pressure to deliver on the economy, and you think GDP has always been quoted. I said, well, GDP is actually a terrible way of measuring progress, because GDP only is an income and expenditure account. It's not a balance sheet. And underlying everything I've said is really the fact that it's our balance sheet that we have been damaging and undermining through this kind of pursuit of economism. And yet, you know, here we all are, you know, the economy matters, it's the economy stupid, remember Clinton? You know, there's been that kind of post-war narrative going on for so long. And of course the economy matters. All of us know that. We do all need jobs. We do all need housing. We do all need the material well-being that befits a sophisticated society like ours. But I think it's true that we also need beauty. And the real question is, what legacy are we creating for the future? Remember Octavia and those ragged school children and how urgently she felt was their need to get access to beauty? Well, you know, today's children, one might argue, live much more sophisticated lives, have many more material benefits than those poor Victorian children. But do they have access to nature? Well, the evidence is pretty concerning. Children today, young children, spend between 6 and 7 hours a day in front of gadgets like this. The area over which we let our children roam free without parental supervision has collapsed by 90% in a single generation. And a child today is 3 times more likely to be admitted to hospital for falling out of bed than falling out of a tree. Now, I am not advocating children falling out of trees, I should make this clear. But actually, it is really, really important that children have the chance to explore, to connect with nature. Remember David Attenborough said once, he said, people will only protect what they care about, and they'll only care about what they've experienced. And so again, I'm afraid there's lovely National Trust people here tonight, and I can't resist, but this was my favourite campaign at the National Trust in so many ways. Because actually this, I hope you've all heard of it, but this was very much a kind of campaign about that sense of spiritual connection, not a campaign about material things at all, absolutely playing to that sort of passion for the future that those founders had back in the 1890s. And it's really about free-range children who can discover the delights of getting muddy and falling over, and actually maybe they do scratch their knees, but they kind of learn about how the real world works, feel connected with nature. It seems to me that this is so important and really just underpins that if we don't give the next generation contact with nature, the chance to experience beauty, then what hope is there for the future? Because we all know that we're not on an optimistic trajectory. We all know we face really big challenges as a society about the pace and scale at which we're still exploiting natural resources, you know, on a path with climate change and other pressures that we really have to think about our priorities. And as I say, this is not about not having development, it's not about no change, it's not about a retrospective and negative view. It is simply about the fact that as humans, we need beauty. We need the things that money can't buy. We draw spiritual succor, happiness, sense of kind of memory and connectedness from experiences that are not material ones and which connect us to nature and connect us very often to other people. Money is important, but it can't on its own make us happy. And so this to me, is a vital opportunity to rediscover that word beauty, to reconnect it to the political and the public language, because I believe it is there among all of us, and to inspire the fight for beauty once again. John Muir, who is the founding father of National Parks of America, said, "This is not about blind opposition to progress, but opposition to blind progress." So I want to reignite the fight for beauty, and I hope you'll join me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dame Fiona. That was a wonderful lecture for us all this evening. I'm going to start the questions and I'll open it up to people to join in. What do we do when we can't agree about beauty? So most of us, I think, would look at the Lake District and say, absolutely, you would protect the Lake District. But you showed one of your slides was Stevenage.
Yeah.
Lots of people would say Stevenage is an ugly town. The new towns were ugly. 60s architecture was ugly. Some of us would say, no, actually, you know, we can't live in Georgian pastiche towns throughout the length and breadth of the country. What do we do when we don't agree on forms of beauty, particularly in the urban environment?
Well, first of all, I think I don't care if we don't agree. I just want us to talk about beauty. I mean, let's get beauty on the agenda. I have no problem if we then have a huge debate about what is beautiful and what people think is not beautiful, because actually that we would be talking about it. At the moment, lots of development happens without even beauty being anywhere on the agenda at all. Lots of big new developments. HS2 is being put through the countryside. Nobody's mentioned the word beauty about how to put a new railway into the landscape. So let's bring it on, say I. But in fact, and I quote some research in the book, there's actually remarkable consensus about what's beautiful. I don't think we should get worried. You know, people like places that, in a sense, look as if they're cared for, look as if someone has kind of thought about them, has designed them, has thought about the relationship of buildings and spaces with each other. Actually, there's a remarkable consensus. But, you know, to me, I think this idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so, you know, we can't agree about it, so let's talk about it, is almost part of the problem.
Okay. Let's open it up to some questions then. Who'd like to start us off? I'm sure there'll be... Yeah, over here, yeah.
I agree that
Two.
beauty is
No, both you.
beauty is, to a certain extent, in the eye of the beholder. So we're talking about things that give us a sense of well-being.
Yeah.
Spatial things, time to relax. And in the creative process, and this is where the economy-driven society forgets that, as you say, money isn't everything. Our families do need to relax together. We do need our children to be able to play. It's no good just them endlessly doing. So there are all these aspects of crushing the human spirit, I think, which we hope that beauty is the complete reverse of that. It lets it free and it gives you space. And of course, nature is one of the prime.
Beautifully said. But I would say, I mean, in case there's any doubt, you know, I'm not arguing that beauty is a thing. I'm arguing really that beauty is a way of seeing things. It's a perspective that helps us make better decisions. Anyway, yes.
Hi, Fiona. I love the talk, and I'm really interested in beauty and the campaigning movement around that as it faces into growth that the nation faces. So I work for the National Trust, so I know Fiona well. And one of the things the National Trust is facing is massive growth because people love the places it protects. And then in terms of the infrastructure and places that we then need to respond, in terms of car parks and other things that come with that, then becomes for us internally hugely controversial. But it's the same in places like Bath, where the pressure of traffic and population growth with things like the park and ride scheme also put massive pressure on, are we willing to let go of a meadow for that growth? And it's coming. And you know, the challenge of where growth will happen, how does the campaigning movement help that happen and not just become a block by saying no, 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 and not finding solutions? So Winchester I know well, and I remember that road really well before the solution was put in place. And we lost something beautiful, but I don't know what the solution would have been without it. So I'm interested in that balance between the campaigning movement's credibility in making sure we've had the judgment debate, as you say, and yet sometimes we may not win it in order for that better management of growth.
Well, again, I mean, a really, really well put question. I mean, I think the truth is that we will have fights which, in a way, at some point, you know, there are elements of winners and losers. But what frustrates me at the moment is that the beauty is just not in that debate. And in a way, what's happened is that we've all, I use those management speaky words, but we've all become kind of terribly caught up in, you know, has something got a kind of economic value? You know, we start ascribing economic value to historic things or beautiful places, to the point where almost you've sort of reduced everything to this very material view. And what I suppose I would like to do is have an open debate. I mean, Bath is a really good example. Actually, you might find that there are quite radical solutions about traffic management, about, you know, opening up kind of new, perhaps new areas for development that hadn't been thought about, if we had that debate. But we sort of hide the debate in a very econometric frame. And it seems to me that it's not about beauty winning over the economy, it's about finding solutions where you get as much beauty out of change as well. And that, in a sense, is perhaps a prize that we haven't done well. I mean, I put the Newtown Stevenage up deliberately because lots of people do go, oh, but actually they were trying. They were really trying to do it, you know, at the time, to do it beautifully and to do it well. And I think it's really important to kind of celebrate that. That's what we've often lost.
That's good. Yep, gentleman here. Yeah.
Oh, you talked about beauty primarily in terms, in human terms.
Yes.
In terms of what it does for us and about the balance. And maybe this is a bit philosophical for an Institute for Policy Research, but surely beauty essentially is for itself. And surely that's what Wordsworth was on about, and those characters, that unless we see it and the beings that inhabit our landscape, which have all disappeared, I haven't heard a cuckoo in Bath for something like 20 years, unless we see them for themselves, we're going to make some serious misjudgments.
Well, I have a huge sympathy with that debate, and actually one of the issues that is, I think we're such a long way away from that being the objective. So in a sense, I'm trying to haul it back to say, use the fact that as humans we're moved by beauty, we're inspired by beauty to be the means by which we get it on the debate, back on the agenda. But there are some strands in the wind. You know, there are big ambitions, we hope, coming from the government about a 25-year environment plan. I mean, the National Trust just announced some fantastic proposals for restoration of nature. You know, there are people talking about these things as a sort of existential value. But I think on a crowded island with the sorts of pressures that Nicola was talking about, you know, one's trying to optimize a lot of the time, trying to bring beauty and progress, if you like, in classic economic terms, together. And that, to me, you know, is part of the solution. It's not the whole solution, but it's a better solution than, you know, a win or lose prospect. But of course, I think more deeply, you're right, and certainly the Wordsworth and Ruskin views were profoundly philosophical. Yeah.
Okay, we have a gentleman here.
Thank you. Good evening. You said that since I think 1944, things have gone downhill. And you mentioned, you used the word spiritual often in your talk.
Yes.
I wonder whether, do you think that society's moved from the sort of Christendom era, so a sense of designer or creator God, however you saw that, moved from that era to this post-Christendom era, or secularism? Do you think that's part of the problem, that we've sort of lost the awe of appreciation?
Gosh, a very big question again. And I do think, actually, that in a world where religion was a very common language and you know, children were grown up and educated in the church and in the Bible, and you know, Ruskin was a really good example of that, but that went on, you know, for a long period. I think there was a language in which this could be expressed. But, you know, I do say in my book that although in many ways, you know, we are a much more secular society, I don't think we're a less spiritual society, is my take on that. And forgive me, because you clearly will have a much more profound knowledge of these things than me. But I'll never forget talking to Bishop James Jones, who chaired the forestry panel, which was set up after the great forestry debacle, saying to me, Fiona, you know, it's always puzzled me that you in the National Trust, which is where I was at the time, have far more people on a Sunday than the Church of England in its entirety. What are you doing that we're not doing? And I did say to him, actually, I thought we were loving people. I did say that. And I wasn't completely sure that the church, in every sense, was loving people. But so we had a very interesting conversation about that. But I do genuinely believe that, in a way, people are always often searching for meaning in life. Now, many people do find that through religion, but I think many people do find it through bodies like the National Trust or the Wildlife Trust or the many charities. It gives people a sense of meaning and purpose, which is explicitly non-material, but which actually is, back to the point about well-being and kind of a feeling that you're living a kind of worthwhile life. I think that's incredibly important for people. I think we all need that sense in life, actually. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Speaking of beauty, my immediate reaction is Beauty and Beast. And I think the repercussions of the economic growth serve as the beast to our society. And I come from China.
Yeah.
So in the past, our government adopted a solution that is to say developing first, then clean up later, which proved to be wrong. And now our government is pretty clear that we have to strike a proper balance between the economic growth and natural resources protection. So my question for you is, what lessons can be drawn from the experiences of the UK, and any suggestions you can give to our country? Thank you.
Goodness, well, that's another very
Advice
big
to the Chinese government. Yes.
Come to Bath for a series of really challenging big questions. I don't know enough about China, but I actually do very much, I sense what you said, that there's been a kind of decision to look at sustainable use of resources, and their involvement in the Paris conference on climate change was a very different message than in the past. And I don't know enough about it, but I think it's a really interesting one. Just on Beauty and the Beast, which I haven't seen the film, but there was an amazing publication, again, back in the 1940s, called Britain and the Beast. This same sense of this kind of beast of development threatening the things that people really loved and cared about. So I think that sort of evocation has been used very, very often. But I think really the point, perhaps it's what I was trying to say in my lecture, that almost we need to stop and say, look, where are we going as a society? What do we really care about? How can we? And it is a sort of word, where harmony or balance or integration keep coming back. How can we achieve, higher standard of living for people that isn't just about, economic measures of success? So better quality of life, better access to nature, better facilities for people to, enjoy everything that this country has to offer, but isn't just focused on material growth. So a kind of a recalibration, if you like, of what we're striving for. Because if we do just continue to strive all the time for economic growth, A, we can't do it, we can't pull it off, and so we'll disappoint people, and B, we will cause more damage to our natural resources. And so in a way, I'm using beauty as a sort of rallying cry to say it's a way of kind of having that debate in a different way, of opening the door to a different set of objectives, in which beauty is a word that's not a technical or bureaucratic word, but is a word that I think means something to people, might help. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions? Anybody else?
There's one here, yeah.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Well, I'm just thinking about the beast, because if you go back to some of the early industrialists, of course, they were terribly aware of beauty.
Yeah.
And so you look at Port Sunlight, recently,
Yes,
fire at the weekend.
Yeah.
You look at the Rowntree's villages,
Yeah.
the Cadburys. I mean, there was a great sense of balancing well-being, beauty with industrial growth.
Yep.
And of course, then they got accused of paternalism and over-intervention into people's lives. And the sort of beauty of people's lives was to be left to government, not to individual philanthropists. So where do we go in the 21st century? What's business's role as a beast?
Well, and again, another little plug for the book, because I do talk a lot about that movement. And in fact, just again, I have bought some copies if anyone would like to buy one. But I do think that actually we've become scared, if you like, of kind of that old-fashioned philanthropy. I think we've become nervous about appearing to be too interventionist or in a sense, too kind of top down, and I think we would do it very differently these days. But I think the outcomes that they were trying to achieve were really important, because they were, very much back to that sort of Octavia Hill vision of, yes, you need a roof over your head, and yes, you need enough to eat, but you also need a sense of quality of life and a kind of sense of beauty around you. And so if you look back, and the new towns were the same, actually, the very first, or the garden cities, they tried to have the arts and crafts architects. I mean, some of them proved too expensive and they had to pull back from it. But, there was a vision about beautiful spaces in which people could live rewarding lives, and not necessarily rich in material terms, but rich in experience and in community benefit and in kind of satisfaction. So I think that's a really important point, and we wouldn't do it in a top-down way today, I'm sure. And there's lots of issues around, innovative planning processes, public engagement, new forms of neighbourhood planning, which do involve people. People hate just things being imposed on them, but if they have a chance to shape their place, you get a much better sense of engagement and opportunity. And I've seen some amazing examples of place-based planning around the country where it is being done well. So I'm not completely pessimistic, but I think it's a different set of outcomes that we need to be championing, and that's what will make the most difference.
Okay, great. Gentleman here. Yeah.
I just wonder if you aren't a bit too despondent about the way things have gone since the 1940s. Because I agree it's management speak, but there have been an awful lot of acts of parliament, such as the Countryside and Wildlife Act, and recently the right to roam legislation, which has given people access to the countryside. I was, for 7 years, chair of the Peak Park Planning Committee, and I like to think we did quite a lot to protect the Peak National Park in terms of the worst excesses of quarrying, for example, or preventing wall-to-wall housing between Manchester and Sheffield. So I think there have been. I think the authorities and so on have held the line pretty well. Though I agree, there's a lot more that could be done.
Well, look, when you're writing a polemic and you're giving a talk, forgive me for some purple prose, because actually I do, in a way, though, I think, and you're right, and listen, actually in the book there's a lot of credit given to the national parks, which I say are a great success story, protection of the coast. There's a lot of detail about actually what's gone on and what's worked, what hasn't worked, but also what has worked, and you're absolutely right. But I think the question is, are we overall comfortable with where we've drawn the line at the moment? And I profoundly believe that, we're at a point in our development as a society where we need some change. We need to kind of new energy around the non-material aspects of life. And so, unashamedly, I think to do that, you have to persuade people that something needs to be different. And actually, the evidence still of the deteriorating baseline around natural resources, nature, the beauty of the countryside is still, despite lots and lots of good things, the overall balance sheet is still going in the wrong direction. So actually, it's a bit of a wake-up call, deliberately, but of course I recognise and take my hat off, actually, to all those. Actually, my children are now in their very early 20s, and I remember when they were in their early teens, they kind of looked at me and said, "Mummy, your generation really messed up, didn't they?" And I'm saying, "Well, I did try," And it is that sense, that they're inheriting a world which is very challenging. And I suppose I'm just saying this is a moment where we could kind of, as I say, recalibrate, and going back to some of the inspiration of that post-war generation, who really did believe in a better world and did a lot to put in place the foundations. And it wouldn't be impossible to recapture that spirit, I believe. So,
what do you?
Something really quick off the back of that. I'm just really interested. You talked about the Lake District, for example, and what we value about that, and you could say it's so well protected, it's fine. Do you see Brexit and coming out of Europe as one of the biggest threats, and our need to be really clear what we're prepared to pay for in terms of cultural landscape, nature, etc., and how the economics works around that, but our need to galvanise in the next 2 to 3 years to set that right is a critical moment like we've not had probably for the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, and there's risks and opportunities, and you know, this is a very interesting moment, and you know, goodness, we could spend the whole evening talking about it, and you know, I freely declare I'm a Remainer, so you know, don't want to sort of send any kind of oblique signals about that. However, we're translating everything across. And if that means what it says, then we have a chance, you know, in our own time to design better policies to some things. I don't want to lose the good things that we've had, but equally, agriculture policy does need redesigning and could be better. And there are other ways in which, you know, we could take, you know, a more kind of decisive step on some of these policies. I have no idea whether we will do that at the moment. I think, you know, we're at such an early stage, but there is a chance to do that, which I hope we will take. So, you know, who knows? It's a difficult and interesting time.
Well, we don't ever have public events now on IPR without discussing Brexit, so I'm glad we got to. But I'm going to give Tom King the last word. It's
Tom,
a great,
it's a
pleasure, privilege to have you here, Tom.
Yes, yes, I do.
And our battle to save Exmoor there.
Yes.
Having had the experience of representing a national park, an AONB in the context, a nuclear power station as well, and the smelliest factory in Somerset, if not in the West Country, in the shape of British cellophane. When you look at what's happening now, I'd like your views on wind power. Because actually it seems to me that you've got wind power. Parts of around here, as we all know, are pretty well saturated with solar panels. And the idea of tidal lagoons in the Bristol Channel obviously is a further development. Would you like to talk about how we're going to get our renewable energy?
Yes.
Worrying about beauty at the same time?
Yeah, very happily. And first of all, I should say, Tom, it's wonderful to see you. And actually, I remember those days, early 1980s, when you were Secretary of State, very, very well. And very touching to see so many people from Emmanuel here and from the National Trust here tonight. So I'm feeling very moved by people have taken the trouble to come. But actually, yes...
I left out one thing, because I don't know if it's happened to you, but I was actually burnt in effigy on West Sedgemoor.
You were.
When they were establishing a nature reserve.
You were.
And I had to go down, but they got over it eventually.
Yeah, that's a badge of honour.
Not by the National Trust, I hope.
I haven't... As far as I know, I haven't yet been burnt in effigy, but the day is, you know, still young. It may still happen. But no, energy is a really, really good example where we clearly do need to diversify our energy generation. We need to conserve a lot more energy, and we're really bad at that. And it's hugely frustrating. I was at power station inquiries repeatedly in the 1980s where we were pressing for energy conservation. It still hasn't happened. We could have saved 20% and we still haven't done it. So we're really, really bad at that. There's a lot of pressure now for decentralizing energy supply and giving more power to local communities for things like combined heat and power and integrated systems, which we are very slow at doing. But yes, we do need to generate some. And again, I'm not anti-wind farms. I'm anti-wind farms in the wrong place. But actually, there are lots of places where wind power could be a really valuable source. But again, we need to plan for beauty as that is the purpose of what we're trying to do. And it was really interesting. I was asked to judge a Landscape Institute prize a couple of years ago. And I was really thrilled to see that some of the prize winners who came forward, they turned out to be prize winners, were people who were local authorities, counties, who were saying, right, where in our county is the right place to put hydro, wind energy, solar, you know, refitting our own estate, a really proactive approach and saying we want to do this in the right place, in the right way, rather than just waiting for, you know, a company to come and foist a great big ugly wind farm in the middle of the North Pennines or something. So it seems to me it's the same point. We can do these things beautifully and well, but we have to want to do them beautifully and well, and we have to create the conditions where it's legitimate to talk about beauty and design and aesthetics and kind of, you know, doing things in the right way in the right place is as important an objective as getting the things built. So this is just exactly the same point, and thank you for raising it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Dame Fiona. It was a wonderful set of answers, actually, just some very interesting and difficult questions.
Yeah, well.
But do come and have, if you want to get a copy of the book, they are at the front here, so do come down and do that.
Yes.
But many thanks for coming to Bath, coming and giving this lecture. Can I ask you to thank Dame Fiona in the usual way?
Thank you.